Good afternoon. Let's take a look.
I hope you can fix it quickly. I'm late for a meeting.
You promised me this car was fixed. Now look at it. I needed this for work tomorrow.
I checked the engine. It was running fine when you left.
I wonder if he even knows what these forms mean.
She pulled into the repair shop with a look of frustration. Her luxury car had stalled in the middle of nowhere. When the mechanic approached, his hands were worn, his uniform stained with oil, and his skin dark as night. She barely looked at him, assuming he couldn't possibly know how to fix what she drove. But what happened next would not only fix her car, it would shatter something much deeper. Because sometimes, life doesn't just test your patience, it tests your prejudice. And that day, she learned a lesson she'd never forget.
Amanda lived in a world where appearances meant everything. She was the kind of woman who believed success was measured by how you looked, what you drove, and who you knew. Her silver luxury car wasn't just transportation, it was a reflection of her worth. Every morning, she'd glide through her suburban neighborhood, waving politely to people she hardly noticed. She didn't mean to look down on others, but she did, especially those who didn't fit her idea of success.
That morning had started like any other. Perfect hair, designer bag, a list of meetings and errands that couldn't wait. But as she sped down a quiet country road, her car began to sputter. Then, with one final jolt, it stopped completely. The engine went silent, no signal, no help nearby, just the hum of distant traffic and her growing panic. She called for roadside assistance, pacing by her car, heels sinking into the dust. Minutes turned to an hour before she saw a truck approaching, a modest pickup worn from years of work. Out stepped a man in a grease-stained uniform, wiping his hands with an old rag. He introduced himself calmly, his tone polite and professional, but Amanda barely looked up.
To her, he was just another mechanic, someone who couldn't possibly understand the precision and engineering behind her expensive vehicle. She crossed her arms, sighing as if this was yet another inconvenience in her perfect day. What she didn't know was that this moment, this simple encounter on a forgotten roadside, would quietly dismantle everything she thought she knew about worth, respect, and the people she once looked past. The man introduced himself as Marcus, his voice steady and kind, the kind that carried quiet confidence. He asked her what happened, and she explained with impatient gestures, barely making eye contact. To her, he was just doing a job. But to Marcus, this was something he'd done 1,000 times before, the kind of problem he could recognize by sound alone.
He knelt beside the car, lifting the hood as a faint trail of smoke rose into the cool air. Amanda stood a few feet away, arms folded, tapping her foot. She scrolled through her phone, pretending to be busy, but her eyes occasionally darted toward him, cautious, skeptical. She noticed the grease on his hands, the worn logo on his uniform, the truck with mismatched paint. Everything about him screamed ordinary, and that, to her, meant less. Marcus spoke softly, explaining what might be wrong, a clogged fuel line, maybe a bad sensor. She barely listened. When he mentioned needing to tow it back to his shop, she hesitated, almost offended by the thought. Her instinct screamed not to trust him. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was prejudice. She couldn't tell the difference anymore.
But with no other option, and the sun beginning to sink behind the trees, she reluctantly agreed. As they drove in silence toward his small-town garage, Amanda couldn't help but notice how different everything looked from her world. Old brick buildings, faded signs, people who nodded and smiled as Marcus passed. He was respected here. It puzzled her. Inside his workshop, the air smelled of oil and metal, a mix of hard work and time. Tools lined the walls with military precision, each one clean, cared for. The place wasn't messy or careless as she expected. It was meticulous, professional. Yet she couldn't shake her bias. Marcus began working methodically, tracing the issue with calm focus. Hours passed, his patience unwavering, while Amanda grew restless. She made a few snide remarks about the car's complexity, about hoping he knew what he was doing. He simply nodded, saying nothing. But in his eyes, there was a quiet sting, not of anger, but of recognition. He had seen this before. Then came the twist, a hidden issue deep in the engine that only an expert would notice. Marcus found it, fixed it, and tested the car until it purred like new. Amanda was stunned. She had called 2 dealerships earlier, both quoting thousands and days of delay, yet this man, whom she barely respected enough to thank, had done it in hours.
But before she could process her guilt, something else caught her eye, a framed photo on the wall. It showed Marcus shaking hands with a group of engineers beside a race car. The caption read, "Lead Mechanical Engineer, National Motors Racing Team." Her stomach dropped. The man she had doubted wasn't just a mechanic, he was one of the best. Marcus noticed her staring but said nothing. He simply handed her the keys, wiped his hands clean, and told her it was ready. The silence between them felt heavy, not awkward, but meaningful. As Amanda turned the key and the engine roared to life, her reflection in the windshield told her everything she didn't want to admit. She had judged a man not by his skill, his character, or his heart, but by the color of his skin. And now she couldn't escape the truth that echoed in her chest. She was wrong, but the real lesson was still waiting.
Amanda stood by her car, the engine humming perfectly, yet she couldn't move. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the workshop floor. Marcus began cleaning his tools, silent, composed, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But inside her, something was breaking. She wanted to say thank you, but the words wouldn't come. They felt too small, too empty for what she'd realized. For hours, she had watched this man work with skill and patience, fixing what others couldn't, never once showing frustration despite her coldness. And now, staring at the photo on the wall again, the truth hit harder than any scolding could have.
Marcus wasn't just a mechanic. He was a teacher, an engineer, a man who'd earned every ounce of respect she had denied him. Still, he didn't boast. He didn't remind her of her arrogance or demand acknowledgement. He simply looked at her, eyes calm but weary, as if he'd lived this moment before, seen the same doubt, the same hesitation, the same quiet prejudice in too many faces. Then, as she reached for her purse, he raised his hand gently. "It's already taken care of," he said softly. "Just glad you got home safe." The kindness in his voice pierced deeper than anger ever could. She froze, feeling her throat tighten, her eyes burning. This wasn't pity, it was grace. The kind of grace that exposes everything ugly inside you without saying a single cruel word. Amanda turned away, unable to meet his eyes. Shame, gratitude, and something like admiration tangled in her chest. She had spent her whole life believing that respect had to be earned by status or wealth. But here stood a man who commanded it by character alone. As she drove away, the road stretched endlessly before her, quiet, heavy with thought. The reflection of his garage faded in her rearview mirror, but his calm, steady gaze stayed with her. That night, she realized something life-changing. Sometimes the loudest lessons come from the people you refuse to listen to. And for the first time, she wished she had listened sooner. Days turned into weeks, but the memory of that afternoon refused to fade. Every time Amanda started her car, she thought of Marcus, of his calm voice, his steady hands, and the quiet strength that needed no recognition. What she once saw as ordinary, she now saw as extraordinary. For the first time, she began noticing the small, invisible walls she had built, the assumptions she made, the judgments she passed without thinking. At meetings, in stores, even while walking through her neighborhood, she realized how often she looked through people instead of at them. The experience with Marcus had peeled something open inside her, a truth she couldn't unsee. Racism wasn't always loud or violent. Sometimes it lived in the silence of unspoken bias, in the polite dismissals, in the way people decided who mattered before hearing a single word. Amanda never saw Marcus again, but she didn't need to. His lesson had already done its work. It wasn't about guilt, it was about awareness, respect, and humility, the kind that changes how you see the world and the people in it. Months later, she drove past the same road where her car had once broken down. This time, she slowed down. She looked at every small garage, every mechanic covered in grease, and wondered how many more like Marcus had been overlooked, underestimated, disrespected, not for who they were, but for what they looked like. That thought stayed with her like a quiet echo, because sometimes the most profound change begins not when we're praised for what we know, but when we're humbled by what we don't. So the next time you look at someone and think you already know their story, ask yourself, what if you're wrong?